I found out my mother-in-law had told everyone I was infertile the same afternoon she asked me to pass the cranberry sauce. It was a quiet Sunday gathering. The kind where the air smelled faintly of roasted chicken and rosemary, and the curtains were pulled halfway open to let in the pale winter sun. Nothing about that day suggested my life was about to tilt sideways. "Clara," my sister-in-law Denise said gently, touching my wrist as I set the bowl down. "You know there are other ways to have a family now." I smiled politely, assuming she was talking about adoption in the abstract. Denise had always been soft-spoken, careful with her words. But then she added, in a voice so tender it made my stomach tighten, "You don't have to carry that disappointment alone." I remember the way the clock ticked on the wall behind her. Slow, deliberate, almost louder than it should have been. "Disappointment?" I asked. She hesitated. Her eyes drifted toward the head of the table, toward Marshall, my mother-in-law. Marshall was slicing her chicken with perfect precision, her posture straight, her pearl earrings catching the light. She looked composed, dignified, almost fragile in that carefully curated way she had. Denise leaned closer. "Your fertility struggles," she whispered. For a moment, the room felt too small. "I don't have fertility struggles," I said quietly. Denise blinked. Then confusion spread across her face, confusion that quickly turned into embarrassment. "Oh," Marshall said as she stopped herself, lips pressing together. I did not look at Marshall immediately. Something inside me needed a second, just 1 second to understand what I was hearing. Instead, I listened. The scrape of silverware, the low hum of the refrigerator, my own heartbeat steady but heavier than before. And beneath my sweater, hidden from every single person at that table, was the secret I had been protecting for 12 weeks. I was pregnant. Before that Sunday, my life had been ordinary in the best possible way. Ethan and I had been married for 4 years. Not the whirlwind kind of marriage you see in movies, no dramatic airport reunions or reckless midnight decisions, but something steadier. We were the quiet type. He worked as a civil engineer, the kind who double-checked door locks before bed and remembered to rotate the tires on my car without being asked. I taught 2nd grade at a small elementary school where the hallway always smelled faintly of crayons and dry erase markers. Our evenings were predictable. Dinner around 6. A shared dishwashing routine. He washed, I dried. Then we'd settle onto the couch, sometimes talking, sometimes just sitting with the comfortable silence that only comes when two people no longer feel the need to fill every space with words. We had started trying for a baby about a year after our wedding. At first, it was exciting, full of hopeful calendars and shy smiles, but months passed, then more months. Eventually, the questions began, mostly from Marshall. She never asked directly. That would have been too obvious. Instead, she used the tone she reserved for church prayer requests. "Have you considered seeing a specialist? I read that stress can interfere with a woman's body. Some women wait too long without realizing it. Always gentle, always concerned, always public." Ethan would squeeze my hand under the table whenever she did this, his silent way of saying, "Ignore her." And I tried. But it is a strange thing how doubt can seep into you even when you don't invite it. So we saw a doctor, then another. Tests were run, blood drawn, charts reviewed, everything came back normal. "Sometimes it just takes time," the doctor told us with an encouraging smile. Still, Marshall's interest never softened. If anything, it sharpened. I remember one afternoon about 8 months ago when she visited unexpectedly. She walked slowly through our home, fingertips grazing the furniture like an appraiser evaluating antiques. When she paused in front of the small room we hoped would someday become a nursery, she sighed. "It's such a lovely space," she said. "It would be a shame if it stayed empty." I told myself she didn't mean harm, that she was simply from a generation where motherhood defined a woman's success. But intention doesn't always lessen the weight of words. Then, in early autumn, something shifted. I woke one morning with a faint nausea that lingered longer than it should have. By the 3rd day, I bought a pregnancy test on my way home from work, hiding it beneath a stack of student worksheets as if someone might recognize it. I took the test before Ethan got home. 2 pink lines appeared almost immediately. I sat on the edge of the bathtub and stared at them until my vision blurred. When Ethan walked through the door later, I handed him the test without saying a word. He looked at it, looked at me. Then laughed, not loudly, but with this stunned, disbelieving joy that made his eyes shine. He dropped his briefcase right there in the hallway and pulled me into his arms. "We're having a baby," he whispered into my hair, as if saying it too loudly might scare it away. That night we talked for hours, about names, about schools, about whether the baby would inherit his patience or my tendency to cry during commercials. But we also made a decision. We would wait before telling anyone. 12 weeks felt safe, responsible, private. And though I didn't say it aloud, I wanted a little time where this miracle belonged only to us. A small, protected world, especially before Marshall could touch it with her expectations. So I bought looser sweaters, scheduled appointments during lunch breaks, learned how to smile through morning nausea, and kept our secret. Until that Sunday lunch when I realized Marshall had been telling people a very different story. After Denise excused herself to refill her water, I finally looked toward the head of the table. Marshall met my gaze with a soft smile, the kind strangers offer each other in waiting rooms. Kind, measured, unreadable. I wondered how long she had been saying it, how many conversations, how many sympathetic head tilts, how many prayers whispered on my behalf without my knowledge. A strange calm settled over me then, the kind that sometimes arrives before a storm. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. "Marshall," I said gently, keeping my voice steady, "may I ask you something?" She set down her fork. "Of course, dear." "Have you been telling people I can't have children?" The room went very still. Ethan looked up sharply. Denise froze mid-sip. Even the clock seemed to pause between seconds. Marshall did not appear surprised. She dabbed the corner of her mouth with her napkin before answering. "I never said can't, Clara," she replied calmly. "I simply shared that you've been having difficulties. People care about you." Her tone carried that same polished concern, the one that made confrontation feel almost impolite. I felt Ethan's knee press against mine under the table. A quiet warning. "Or maybe support?" "I see," I said, and in that moment I understood something with a clarity that made my chest tighten. This was not a misunderstanding. This was a narrative she had created, one where I was lacking. One where she could be the sympathetic mother waiting for the grandchild that might never come. I rested my hand lightly over my abdomen, still flat, still hidden, still ours. Marshall followed the movement briefly, though I doubted she understood it. Not yet. But suddenly I was certain of one thing: when the truth came out, it would not unfold gently. And for the first time since seeing those two pink lines, Joy shared space with something else. A quiet, gathering resolve. I would protect this child. Even if it meant standing against the woman who believed she knew what was best for our family. Even if it meant letting her story unravel in front of everyone she had told. I picked up my glass, my fingers steady despite the tremor inside me. Across the table, Marshall resumed eating, unaware that the ground beneath her carefully constructed version of me had already begun to crack. And I let her, for now, because some truths need the right moment to be heard. And I had a feeling that moment was coming sooner than she expected. I did not confront Marshall again that afternoon, not because I was afraid of her, but because I suddenly understood something important about people who build quiet stories behind your back. They rarely expect patience. They expect tears, anger, defensiveness, but patience unsettles them. So I finished my meal, passed the bread when asked, even complimented the lemon pie. If Marshall noticed the careful distance in my voice, she gave no sign. On the drive home, Ethan kept both hands on the steering wheel, his jaw tight in a way I had only seen a few times before. We drove in silence for nearly 10 minutes before he spoke. I didn't know she was saying that. "I believe you," I said softly. He exhaled through his nose. "I've told her before to stop asking about babies. I thought she had." I watched the winter trees blur past the window, leafless, still, waiting for a season that always returns eventually. "She didn't stop," I said. "She just changed the story." Ethan glanced at me then, concern replacing frustration. "You're shaking." I hadn't noticed until he said it. Not violently, just a faint tremor in my hands, like the body remembers something the mind is still trying to sort through. "Pull over," he said gently. "There's no need." "Clara." He used the tone that always made me feel safe, firm but warm. He guided the car into a quiet parking lot beside a closed hardware store. The engine idled. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then his gaze dropped slowly to my abdomen. "Our baby heard all of that today," he murmured. Emotion rose in my throat so suddenly I had to look away. "I kept thinking," I whispered, "what if she tells someone who tells someone else, and suddenly the whole town is pitying me while I'm secretly carrying life?" Ethan reached for my hand. "We can tell them now." The offer hung gently between us, tempting, immediate relief. But something inside me resisted. No, I said after a moment. Why not? I searched for the right words, because I don't want our child's first introduction to the world to be a correction. He frowned slightly. I want it to be joy, I continued, not damage control. He was quiet for a long time after that, then he nodded once. Okay, we wait. That was Ethan's way. When he chose your side, he stood there completely. No half measures, no quiet negotiations behind closed doors. We drove the rest of the way home with the radio low, his thumb brushing absent circles across the back of my hand. But that night, long after he fell asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. And for the first time since learning I was pregnant. I felt protective in a deeper way, not just of the baby, but of the emotional world this child would enter, because families are ecosystems, and stories, especially false ones, have roots. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing things I had missed before. It started at the grocery store. I was comparing jars of pasta sauce when Mrs. Daly from Ethan's childhood church approached me with a smile that carried too much sympathy for a casual encounter. Clara, dear, she said, squeezing my elbow, I've been praying for you, for me. For your struggle. There it was again, that word, struggle. I thanked her politely, my teacher voice slipping into place, warm, neutral, controlled, but inside something sharpened. 2 days later, a colleague in the school faculty lounge placed a pamphlet beside my coffee, Support for Women Facing Infertility. She looked embarrassed. I hope you don't mind, Marshall mentioned you might appreciate resources. I stared at the pamphlet, then folded it carefully and slipped it into my bag, not out of gratitude, but because suddenly this felt less like gossip and more like a campaign. That evening, I told Ethan everything. He leaned back in his chair slowly processing. She told people at your work, apparently. His calm unsettled me more than anger would have, because Ethan only went quiet when something truly crossed a line. I'll talk to her, he said. But again, I surprised both of us. Not yet. He looked at me carefully. What are you thinking? I hesitated, then admitted something I hadn't fully formed until that moment. I want to understand why. Why she'd lie, yes. Ethan rubbed his temple. My mother cares a lot about appearances. That's not the same as inventing my medical history. No, he admitted quietly. The following Sunday, Marshall invited us to brunch. Normally, I might have declined, feigned exhaustion, blamed schoolwork, but now I wanted to observe. Her house smelled faintly of lavender polish as always, everything in its place. Photographs aligned perfectly along the hallway, Ethan at 7 holding a soccer trophy, Ethan at 16 in a pressed suit before prom. Not a single frame hinted at disorder. Even memory in Marshall's home was curated. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek. You look pale, Clara. Are you eating enough iron? I'm fine, thank you. Her eyes lingered on me a second too long. Was it suspicion, or simply habit, her constant search for flaws to correct? During brunch, she spoke at length about the Hendersons' new grandchild. 8 pounds, full head of hair. Such a blessing, she said wistfully. Then she added almost absent-mindedly, some women are simply more suited to motherhood. Ethan set his fork down. Mother. She blinked innocently. Yes. That was unnecessary. Oh, Ethan, don't be so sensitive. We were discussing biology. Biology, as if my body were a failed experiment she was reviewing. I kept my voice calm. Marshall, may I ask you something directly? Of course, dear. Why have you been telling people I'm infertile? She did not answer immediately. Instead, she folded her napkin once, twice, aligning the corners. Finally, she sighed. I worried people would keep asking when you were going to have children, she said. This way, they stop. It protects you. The explanation was so composed, so rehearsed that for a brief moment I almost questioned my own hurt. But then I saw it, not protection, control. You could have asked what I wanted shared, I said. I did what mothers do, she replied simply. You are not my mother? The words slipped out before I could soften them. A flicker passed across her face, gone in an instant, but real. Ethan cleared his throat. Mom, this ends now. She lifted her chin slightly, very well. Yet something in her tone suggested compliance without agreement. As we prepared to leave, she hugged me lightly. Her hand rested for a fraction too long against my stomach. You never know what life will bring, she murmured. A chill traced my spine. Did she suspect? Or was it merely another one of her layered statements? That night I stood before the bathroom mirror longer than usual. At 13 weeks there was the faintest curve beginning, not visible to others, but undeniable to me. I placed both hands there. Our little secret, I whispered. The baby shifted, or perhaps it was only my imagination. Either way, warmth spread through me, and with it, clarity. I could not control Marshall's words, but I could choose the moment our truth stepped into the light. Weeks passed. Winter softened toward early spring. The nausea faded, replaced by a steady, grounding energy. At our 16-week appointment, the doctor let us hear the heartbeat again. Fast, determined, Ethan laughed under his breath. "That's my kid." Afterward, as we walked back to the car, he asked quietly, "When do we tell them?" I looked up at the pale blue sky. Soon, and fate, it seemed, agreed, because 3 days later Marshall called with unusual excitement. "I'm hosting a family dinner next Saturday," she announced. "Everyone will be there." Something in her voice carried anticipation. The kind that hums beneath the surface. "Is it a special occasion?" I asked. "A small announcement," she said vaguely. Curiosity brushed against my instincts. "What kind of announcement?" "Oh, you'll see." After I hung up, unease settled in my chest. That Saturday evening, her dining room glowed with candlelight. More guests than usual filled the space, cousins, neighbors, even members from her church circle. I recognized several of the sympathetic faces, people who believed they knew my private sorrow. Halfway through dinner, Marshall rose gracefully and tapped her glass. The room quieted. "I want to thank you all for coming," she began. Her smile was luminous, practiced. "As many of you know, becoming a grandmother has long been my deepest hope." My pulse quickened. Beside me, Ethan went still. Marshall continued. "While Ethan and Clara have faced certain challenges, there it was again, carefully phrased pity. Family is about more than biology." She gestured toward a young couple across the table, Ethan's cousin Mark and his wife. "They have asked me to be godmother to their baby." Applause filled the room. Relief flickered through me until she added softly, "And in some ways that will have to be enough." Enough. The word landed like a quiet verdict. In that moment, something inside me settled, not anger, not humiliation, something steadier. It was time. I felt Ethan's hand close around mine. "Clara," he whispered, "we don't have to do this now." But I shook my head gently. "Yes," I said, "we do." I pushed my chair back slowly and stood. The room's attention shifted. Marshall looked surprised, genuinely this time. I placed one hand over the small curve beneath my dress, took a breath, and spoke clearly. "Actually, Marshall, you won't have to settle for being a godmother." The silence that followed felt almost sacred. Ethan rose beside me, and when I said the next words, my voice did not tremble. "You're going to be a grandmother." Gasps rippled across the table. A fork clattered to the floor. Denise covered her mouth with both hands. Marshall stared at me, truly stared, as if her eyes could rearrange reality. "You're pregnant?" she whispered. 20 weeks next Tuesday." For the first time since I had known her, Marshall had no words, and in the fragile, echoing quiet of that candlelit room, the story she had told about me began to collapse. For a moment, no one moved. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, it feels crowded. Thick with thoughts no one is yet brave enough to speak aloud. Marshall remained standing at the head of the table, her fingers still wrapped around the stem of her glass. I watched the color drain from her face, leaving behind a pale stillness that made her pearl earrings seem almost too bright against her skin. "You're certain?" she asked finally. The question might have sounded practical to someone else, but I heard what lived underneath it. How could I have been wrong? I rested my palm more firmly against my abdomen. "Yes." Ethan's hand slid around my back, warm and grounding. "We wanted to wait before sharing," he added calmly, "but tonight seemed appropriate." No accusation in his tone, no sharpness. Just truth laid gently on the table. Denise was the first to move. She rushed toward me and wrapped her arms carefully around my shoulders. "Oh my goodness, Clara, I am so happy for you." Then, softer, "Meant only for me. I am also so sorry." I squeezed her hand. "It's all right." But it was, not entirely, because apologies do not erase narratives once they've taken root in a room full of witnesses. Across the table, Mark let out a low whistle. "Well, this calls for new champagne," he said, trying to dissolve the tension with humor. A few people laughed, grateful for permission to breathe again, but Marshall did not laugh. She sat down slowly, too slowly, as if she were recalibrating her place in a world that had just shifted without her consent. "I wish you had told me," she said after a moment. There it was, not congratulations, not joy, a quiet grievance. I chose my words carefully. "I wish you had asked before telling people I couldn't have children." Our eyes met. And for the first time, Marshall looked smaller, not physically, but socially, like a woman suddenly aware that the room was measuring her. "I only shared what I believed to be true," she said. "Why did you believe it?" Ethan asked gently. She hesitated, then folded her hands together on the table. "Because months passed, years nearly, people talk, they ask questions. I thought if I framed it delicately, it would protect you from harsher speculation." Her voice was steady, but something beneath it quivered, not quite regret, not quite defensiveness. I studied her face and realized something that complicated my anger. Marshall did not see herself as cruel. She saw herself as a steward of family image, a curator of acceptable narratives, and in her mind, uncertainty was untidy, so she had replaced it with a story she could manage. "I never asked you to manage my story," I said quietly. A murmur of agreement moved faintly through the guests, quickly suppressed but present. Marshall noticed. Of course she did. She had always possessed the instincts of a woman who could read a room in seconds. Her chin lifted a fraction. "Well," she said, regaining composure, "what matters now is that a child is coming." She raised her glass again, this time with a deliberate smile. "To new beginnings." Glasses clinked, voices rose, conversation resumed, but something fundamental had changed, not just for Marshall, for me. Because in that moment, I understood that silence, the one I had practiced for years in the face of her subtle intrusions, was no longer a space I could comfortably inhabit, not with a child on the way. Later that evening, as guests gathered their coats, Mrs. Daly approached me again, her expression now flushed with embarrassment. "Clara, I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," I replied gently. "But I repeated it," she confessed. "The infertility, I mentioned it in prayer circles. I thought I was supporting you." Her eyes shone with genuine remorse, and suddenly my frustration softened, not toward Marshall, but toward the way misinformation spreads through kindness just as easily as malice. "It's all right," I said. "Now you can tell them the update." She smiled weakly. "Oh, I will." Across the room, I saw Marshall watching that exchange, cataloging it, understanding perhaps for the first time the scale of what her words had built. On the drive home, Ethan was unusually quiet again, but this silence felt different from the one weeks earlier, less tense, more contemplative. "You were incredible tonight," he said finally. "I was terrified. You didn't look it." I let out a soft breath. "I kept thinking about our baby, about the day they'll ask what kind of family they were born into." He glanced at me. "And what will you say?" I thought about it. "That truth matters," I answered, "even when it makes people uncomfortable." He reached over and squeezed my knee. "I'm proud of you." When we pulled into the driveway, I didn't get out right away. Instead, I tilted my head back and looked at the dark sky. Pregnancy had made me strangely aware of time, not just the future, but the lineage behind us, what we inherit, what we choose to interrupt. "I don't want our child growing up around quiet distortions," I said. "They won't," Ethan replied, and I believed him, mostly. The next morning, my phone buzzed repeatedly. Messages poured in. Congratulations, shock, heart emojis, even a few sheepish apologies. Denise called mid-morning. "Mom is mortified," she said without preamble. I leaned against the kitchen counter. "Is she?" "She had no idea you were pregnant. She keeps saying she misread the situation." "That's one way to phrase it." Denise hesitated. "She also feels hurt that you didn't tell her." I let out a small, incredulous laugh. "Hurt?" "Clara," Denise said softly, "you know how she is. Control makes her feel safe." I traced the rim of my mug with my finger. Control often makes other people feel very unsafe. Denise didn't argue. Before hanging up, she added, "She wants to host a proper celebration. A family luncheon to honor you." The offer sat strangely with me. Part of me recoiled at the idea of Marshall orchestrating yet another narrative, but another part, calmer, more strategic, recognized something else. This was not just about embarrassment. It was about restoration, public restoration. "I'll think about it," I said. After we ended the call, I walked into the spare room, the one we had quietly begun transforming. A soft sage color now brushed the walls. A single bookshelf stood assembled. On the dresser rested a tiny pair of socks Ethan had bought impulsively. I picked them up, so small, so impossibly full of promise, and suddenly tears slipped down my cheeks, not from sadness, from the sheer magnitude of what was coming. I realized then that protecting this child would sometimes require gentleness and sometimes unmistakable boundaries. 3 days later, Marshall called me directly, not Ethan, me. Her voice carried none of its usual ceremonial polish. "Clara," she began, "may we have tea?" The simplicity of the request told me this conversation mattered. "Yes," I said. That afternoon, I sat across from her in her sunroom where pale light filtered through gauzy curtains. She poured tea with steady hands, though I noticed she added sugar without asking, something she had never forgotten before. "I owe you an apology," she said at last. The words seemed unfamiliar in her mouth. "I spoke out of assumption," she continued, "and perhaps impatience." I waited. Because apologies reveal themselves fully only when allowed space. "I wanted a grandchild so badly," she admitted. Each passing holiday felt like a door quietly closing. Her gaze drifted toward the garden. "I told myself I was preparing others for disappointment, but in truth, I was preparing myself." The honesty startled me not because it excused her, but because it humanized her. Loneliness often disguises itself as authority. "I understand longing," I said softly, "but longing doesn't grant ownership over someone else's story." She nodded slowly. "You're right." A fragile silence settled between us. Then she reached across the table, hesitated, and rested her hand lightly over mine. "May I start again?" she asked. The question carried more humility than I had ever heard from her. I thought about the child growing inside me, about the family they would inherit, about the difference between punishment and growth. "Yes," I said finally, "but starting again requires something new." "And what is that?" "Trust," I replied. "Not performance, not image, just truth." Her fingers tightened slightly around mine. "You have it." For the first time since I had known Marshall, I believed she meant it, not perfectly, not permanently, but sincerely in that moment. As I rose to leave, she walked me to the door, then almost shyly her eyes dropped to my stomach. "May I?" she asked. I nodded. Her hand rested there, tentative, reverent, and when she smiled, it was not the social smile she wore for rooms. It was quieter, almost childlike. "My grandchild," she whispered. Something in my chest loosened, not forgiveness, not fully, but the possibility of it. And sometimes, possibility is where healing begins. In the weeks after our conversation in the sunroom, something subtle shifted between Marshall and me. Not warmth, not yet, but awareness. She called before sharing news with extended family. She asked instead of assuming. And once, when a neighbor asked loudly at the market whether I had finally seen a fertility specialist, Marshall corrected her before I could open my mouth. "Clara was never infertile," she said calmly. "She was private." It was a small sentence, but I understood what it cost her to say it publicly. Revisions, after all, require humility. Still, trust is not rebuilt through a single gesture. It grows slowly, like muscle healing after a tear. Spring arrived gently that year. The trees outside our bedroom window softened into green, and with them, my body softened too, rounding now in ways that no loose sweater could hide. At 22 weeks, the baby kicked for the first time while I was correcting spelling tests. I froze, my red pen hovering above the word beautiful, misspelled in 3 different ways. There it was again, a tiny flutter, not dramatic, more like someone brushing the inside of a curtain. I pressed my palm there and laughed quietly to myself. That evening, I guided Ethan's hand to the same spot. We waited, nothing, then a faint tap, his eyes widened. "Was that?" "Yes." He exhaled a disbelieving laugh. "Okay, that's incredible." After that, he spoke to my stomach each night with solemn dedication, updating the baby on traffic patterns, weather forecasts, and once, very seriously, the importance of good tire maintenance. "You are going to be a deeply practical parent," I told him. "Someone has to be." For a while, life felt almost uncomplicated until Marshall called again. "I'd like to host a luncheon," she said. "A proper celebration this time, no surprises, just family." I hesitated. "Clara," she added quietly, "I want to do this right." And so, against my instinct to keep things small, I agreed. Perhaps because part of healing involves allowing people the chance to show you who they are trying to become. The luncheon was held on a bright Saturday. Marshall's backyard had been transformed, long white tablecloths, simple floral arrangements, glass pitchers sweating in the sun. Not extravagant. Intentional. When I arrived, conversations paused briefly, then resumed with smiles that felt genuine rather than sympathetic. Denise hurried over first. "You look radiant," she said. "I look warm," I corrected, fanning myself. She laughed. Across the yard, Marshall approached, holding a small wrapped box. "For you," she said. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet engraved with a single word, "Mother." My throat tightened unexpectedly. "Thank you," I managed. I chose it the day after dinner, she admitted. I wasn't sure when to give it. The admission mattered. It meant she had been thinking or reflecting, not merely reacting. As guests settled, Marshall stood to speak. I felt Ethan's fingers lace through mine beneath the table. Some months ago, she began, her voice carrying easily across the yard, I spoke carelessly about Clara. The directness startled everyone, including me. I allowed my assumptions to become statements. For that, I am deeply sorry. A hush spread through the gathering. I have learned, she continued, that hope does not entitle us to certainty and love does not grant us authority over another person's story. Her eyes found mine. Clara, thank you for your grace and for the grandchild who has already made me a better listener. Emotion rose so swiftly I had to blink it back. Applause followed, not loud but steady, respectful, and in that moment something inside me unclenched further, not erased, but eased. Afterward, as people mingled, several women approached to share their own stories, miscarriages, long waits, unexpected pregnancies. I realized then how rarely we speak honestly about the fragile paths that lead to motherhood, how easily silence gets filled by speculation. Later, Marshall joined me beneath the shade of an umbrella. I meant what I said, she murmured. I know. She studied me for a moment. Are you afraid? She asked. The question surprised me. Yes, I answered truthfully, but it's a hopeful kind of fear. She nodded. I was terrified when I carried Ethan. Every ache felt like a warning. We sat quietly. Two women connected now not by roles, mother-in-law, daughter-in-law, but by something older, shared vulnerability. Then she said something I did not expect. My own mother told people I was unfit when I became pregnant at 21. I turned toward her. She believed I was too young. Too impulsive? She shared her worries with anyone who would listen. A sad smile touched her lips. I swore I would never make my child feel publicly judged. Understanding settled slowly over me. Pain, unexamined, often repeats itself, not out of cruelty, out of habit. I'm trying to break that inheritance, she said quietly. And for the first time, I saw not the formidable matriarch, but a woman still negotiating her own history. By early summer, the baby's movements had grown stronger. One evening, while Ethan assembled the crib, a sharp tightening wrapped around my abdomen. It lasted only seconds, but it stole my breath. Ethan, I said calmly, though my pulse raced. He looked up instantly. What is it? I don't know, it just felt different. Within the hour, we were at the hospital, not panicked but alert. The monitors hummed steadily as the nurse adjusted the straps around my belly. The baby's heartbeat filled the room. Fast, reliable, beautiful. Likely Braxton Hicks, the doctor assured us. Your body is rehearsing. Rehearsing. The word comforted me. Practice, not danger. Still, as we drove home beneath a sky streaked with pink, Ethan kept glancing at me. You scared me, he admitted. I scared myself. That night he slept with one arm draped protectively across me as if proximity alone could guarantee safety. But pregnancy has a way of sharpening intuition, and mine began whispering that control, no matter how carefully rebuilt, is always temporary. 2 weeks later, at 28 weeks, the phone rang just after dawn. Marshall's voice trembled. Clara, are you awake? Yes. There's been an accident, Ethan. The world narrowed instantly. What happened? His car was struck at an intersection. He's conscious. They're taking him to St. Mary's. I don't remember dressing, only motion. The hospital smelled sharply of antiseptic and overbrewed coffee. When I reached his room, he was sitting up, a thin cut along his temple, his left arm in a sling. Relief hit so hard my knees weakened. You're okay, I whispered. I'm okay, he repeated. The doctor explained, a fractured collarbone, bruising, nothing life-threatening. Still, the image of how quickly life can tilt stayed with me long after we returned home. For weeks, I helped him button shirts, tie shoes, open jars. And in that fragile season, Marshall showed up quietly, dropping off meals, driving Ethan to follow-ups, watering our plants without being asked. One afternoon, as she chopped vegetables beside me, she said softly, I used to believe strength meant anticipating every outcome. She paused, but perhaps it means learning to live gently with uncertainty. I looked down at my swollen belly. The baby shifted, firm, insistent. Yes, I said. Perhaps it does. And yet life was not finished testing us, because at 31 weeks during a routine checkup, the doctor grew unusually silent while measuring. She repeated the scan, then once more. Is something wrong? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She turned toward us carefully. "I want to monitor you more closely," she said. "Your blood pressure is higher than I'd like, and there are early signs we should not ignore." A low hum filled my ears. "What kind of signs?" She met my gaze steadily. "Possible preeclampsia." The word landed heavy, clinical, unforgiving. "We'll take every precaution," she assured us. "But I need you resting, no unnecessary stress." As we walked back to the car, the world felt altered again, more fragile, more precious. Ethan opened my door slowly. "We'll do whatever it takes," he said. I nodded, but inside, a quiet fear had begun to grow. And for the first time since announcing my pregnancy, joy shared space with the unmistakable shadow of uncertainty. The word preeclampsia followed me home like an unwanted guest. It lingered in the corners of every room, settled into the folds of freshly washed sheets, hovered in the quiet space between Ethan and me when neither of us knew what to say. High blood pressure, possible early delivery, risk. The doctor had spoken calmly, the way professionals do when they want to steady you, but I heard the caution beneath her tone. "Rest," she had said, "reduce stress, call immediately if anything feels different." Different. Pregnancy was already a landscape of constant change. Now I was being asked to distinguish normal unfamiliarity from dangerous unfamiliarity. That night, Ethan propped pillows behind my back with careful precision. "You are not lifting a single thing heavier than a book," he declared. "I teach second grade," I reminded him gently. "Everything is heavier than a book." He did not smile. "I'm serious, Clara. So am I. I can't just disappear from my classroom." But 2 days later, after my principal quietly reviewed the doctor's recommendation, she insisted I begin early maternity leave. "I'd never forgive myself if you pushed too hard," she said. Packing my classroom felt strangely emotional, like closing a chapter before I was ready. The children made me a card covered in crooked hearts and glitter that refused to stay attached. One student, Ava, hugged my belly and whispered, "Please tell the baby I already love them." I cried in the parking lot afterward. Not from sadness, from the overwhelming reminder that life was already reaching toward this child. Rest, I quickly learned, is not as peaceful as it sounds when your mind refuses to follow your body. I noticed every sensation, every tightening, every flutter. Every absence of movement that lasted a second too long. At night, I lay awake counting kicks, timing breaths, negotiating silently with a future I could not control. Ethan tried to carry calm for both of us. He adjusted his work schedule, answered emails from home, learned how to cook 3 new meals with determined seriousness. One evening, as he set a plate of roasted vegetables in front of me, he said quietly, "My job right now is simple, keep you safe." "You can't control everything," I replied. He met my eyes. "No, but I can control how loved you are while we face it." The steadiness in his voice anchored me more than any medical reassurance, and then, unexpectedly, so did Marshall. She arrived one afternoon with grocery bags and an air of quiet efficiency. "I've made soups," she announced. "Low sodium." I blinked in surprise. "You researched preeclampsia, of course." She moved through the kitchen like someone who understood that help is most powerful when it is practical rather than performative. Later, as we sat together, she studied my face carefully. "Fear is exhausting," she said. I nodded. "Yes." She hesitated, then added, "When Ethan was 5, he developed pneumonia. For 3 nights, I slept upright beside his bed because I was terrified his breathing would stop if I closed my eyes." Her voice softened with memory. "You learn something in those moments. Love is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to remain present despite it." I rested my hand over hers, and again I saw the woman beneath the role, not perfect, not always gentle, but trying. At 33 weeks, the swelling began, first my ankles, then my fingers. My wedding ring pressed tightly into my skin until Ethan insisted we remove it. "We'll put it back on when the baby arrives," he promised. The next appointment came sooner than expected. The nurse took my blood pressure twice, then a third time. Her smile remained, but it had grown professional, less casual. The doctor entered quickly. "I don't want to alarm you," she said, which of course meant I should be alarmed, "but your numbers are climbing. Hospital monitoring was recommended, just precautionary," she added. "But precaution still requires a suitcase." As Ethan packed, I stood in the nursery doorway, absorbing the unfinished calm of the room, the folded blankets, the waiting crib, the mobile still in its box. "Come back to this," I whispered to myself. The hospital room was bright in that particular sterile way that erases any sense of time. Machines hummed softly. Nurses came and went. Ethan rarely left my side, and Marshall, without asking, organized a quiet relay of support: meals, plant watering, mail collection. No announcements, no theatrics. Just presence. On the second evening, she sat beside me knitting something pale yellow. "What is that?" I asked. "A blanket," she replied. "Every baby deserves one made by hand." The needles clicked steadily, a small, comforting rhythm. "Clara," she said after a while, "may I tell you something honestly? Always. I regret that the beginning of this child's story includes my mistake." Emotion tightened my throat. "But perhaps," she continued, "it will also include my growth." I looked at her, really looked, and realized forgiveness had been quietly unfolding long before either of us named it. "I think," I said softly, "families are less about perfection and more about repair." She smiled faintly. "Yes, repair." 3 nights into monitoring, a sharp headache woke me before dawn. Not the dull ache of poor sleep, something deeper, insistent. The nurse checked my pressure, her brows knit slightly. Within minutes, the doctor arrived. "We're moving toward delivery," she said gently. "It's safer not to wait." The words seemed to echo, 34 weeks, too early, yet necessary. Ethan gripped my hand so tightly I could feel his pulse racing. "Will the baby be okay?" he asked. "We have an excellent neonatal team," she assured us. Calm, competent, prepared. Still, as they wheeled me toward the delivery suite, fear threaded through me, sharp but strangely clarifying. This was no longer about expectations, or narratives, or even reconciliation. This was about meeting the small life who had already reshaped ours. Labor unfolded in a blur of instructions and breath. Ethan's voice stayed close, steady in my ear. "You're doing beautifully." At some point, Marshall appeared at the doorway, not entering, just watching with shining eyes, her hands clasped tightly together. Hours later, a cry split the air. Thin, defiant, perfect. "It's a girl," the doctor announced. Relief crashed over me so completely I began to sob. They placed her briefly against my chest, impossibly tiny, her skin warm and damp, her fingers curling instinctively. "Hello," I whispered. She was whisked to the neonatal unit soon after, strong but needing support. Watching them wheel her away tested a part of my heart I had not known existed, but the nurse squeezed my shoulder. "She's a fighter." Ethan kissed my forehead, his tears falling freely now. "You did it," he murmured. "No," I said weakly, smiling. "We did." Through the window later, Marshall stood beside us, gazing at the incubator. "My granddaughter," she breathed, "no performance, just awe." And in that quiet hospital corridor, 3 generations stood together, bound not by flawless beginnings, but by the fragile, miraculous persistence of love. Yet even as joy settled in, I sensed that motherhood was about to ask something deeper of me, not just tenderness, but strength I had never needed before. The first time I held my daughter without wires between us, the world grew very quiet. They placed her gently into my arms 5 days after her birth. 5 days of watching through glass, 5 days of asking permission before touching her, 5 days of learning that love can ache physically when separated from its source. "She's maintaining her temperature beautifully," the nurse said softly, "and her breathing is strong, strong." I traced the curve of her cheek with one finger. Her skin was softer than anything I had ever known, like touching warmth itself. Ethan stood beside me, one hand resting on my shoulder, the other cupped protectively around her tiny feet. "She has your mouth," he whispered. "And your stubbornness," I replied. He smiled. "We named her Leela Grace. Leela because it sounded like light, Grace because without it none of us would have arrived here whole." Marshall cried when she heard the name, not loudly. Just a quiet overflow she did not bother to hide. Bringing Leela home felt both surreal and deeply ancient, as if women had been making this careful walk from hospital to threshold forever. The nursery, once waiting in stillness, now hummed with purpose. The yellow blanket Marshall had knitted rested neatly in the crib. When she saw it there, she touched the edge lightly. "I wasn't sure you'd use it," she admitted. "It's the first thing she slept in," I told her. Something softened across her face, relief perhaps. The early days blurred into a rhythm measured in feedings and fragile sleep. Morning arrived whether we were ready or not. Night folded into itself. Time no longer belonged to clocks, it belonged to Leela. Sometimes I would wake before her just to watch the small rise and fall of her chest. Proof, miracle, responsibility. Fear did not disappear after birth. If anything, it sharpened. I checked her breathing more times than I could count. Listened for sounds that did not exist. Googled questions at 3 in the morning that only deepened my anxiety. One night, after finding me standing beside the crib for the fourth time, Ethan guided me gently back to bed. "She's okay," he murmured. "How do you know?" "Because she's ours," he said simply. "And we are watching." But motherhood, I was learning, is partly the art of accepting that watching is never the same as controlling. Marshall did not overwhelm us with visits. That, more than anything, signaled her transformation. She called first, asked what we needed. Sometimes the answer was nothing more than folded laundry. Other days it was silence, the rare gift of uninterrupted sleep. While she sat in the rocking chair, Leela nestled against her chest, I would wake to the sound of Marshall humming. Low, unpolished, tender. Once from the hallway I heard her whisper, "I will never assume your story, little one. You will tell me who you are." The words caught somewhere deep inside me. Repair, I realized again, is not declared. It is demonstrated in small, consistent acts. Yet healing rarely moves in a straight line. 3 weeks after we came home, I took Leela to the pediatrician alone for the first time. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and baby powder, a strange combination that already felt familiar. A woman across from me smiled warmly. "How old?" "3 weeks. She's beautiful," the woman said. Then, with casual friendliness, she added, "You must feel so relieved after everything you went through." My stomach tightened. "Everything?" "Oh," she said, lowering her voice, "Marshall told my sister you had such difficulty conceiving." Years of heartbreak? There it was, an echo, not new damage, just the lingering sound of the old narrative traveling farther than we had realized. I surprised myself by staying calm. "We were fortunate," I said evenly, "but some stories grow larger than the truth." She looked embarrassed. "I didn't mean to." "I know," I assured her. Driving home, I thought about how long words live once released, longer than apologies, longer than corrections. That evening I told Marshall gently. She closed her eyes briefly. "I will call her," she said. "You don't have to chase every rumor," I replied. "No," she agreed, "but I must be accountable for the ones I began." The next Sunday at church, she stood beside me and in the middle of casual conversation said clearly, "Clara was never infertile. I spoke out of turn months ago and I regret it deeply." No dramatics, no self-defense, just truth. It was not comfortable to witness, humility rarely is, but it mattered, and slowly the echoes began to fade. Around that time, something unexpected happened inside me. The anger I had carried, once sharp enough to wake me at night, softened into something quieter. Perspective, perhaps, or the simple rearrangement that occurs when you hold a child and realize how much of life is still ahead. One afternoon, while Leela slept against my chest, Marshall said thoughtfully, "Motherhood rewrites you, doesn't it?" "Yes," I answered. "In pencil first, then ink." She smiled. "I wish someone had told me that sooner. I might have been less rigid with Ethan." "Rigidity often comes from fear," I said gently. She nodded. "I see that now." We sat in companionable silence. Then she added, "You will make different mistakes than I did." The honesty startled me into laughter. "I'm counting on it." At 6 weeks postpartum, exhaustion caught up with me, not dramatically, just a slow unraveling, tears arriving without clear cause, patience thinning, sleep never quite enough. One afternoon, after crying because the dishwasher sounded too loud, I admitted it aloud. "I don't feel like myself." Ethan knelt beside me. "You just did something monumental. Your body, your mind, they're recalibrating." Still, the fog worried me. When I mentioned it to Marshall, she responded without hesitation. "You are not meant to carry this alone." The next morning, she arrived with a list of postpartum support resources, therapists, groups, lactation consultants. Not intrusive, prepared. "I had no help after Ethan," she said quietly. "I thought strength meant silence. It doesn't." With her encouragement and Ethan's, I spoke to a counselor. Just a few sessions, but enough to remind me that vulnerability is not failure. It is maintenance. Gradually, the fog lifted, and in its place came a steadier version of myself, still tender but stronger. One evening, nearly 2 months after Leela's birth, we gathered for dinner at Marshall's house again. The same dining room where, months earlier, I had first learned of her story about me. Now, Leela slept in a small bassinet beside the table. At one point, Denise glanced around and laughed softly. "Can you believe how different this room feels?" She was right. Nothing had physically changed, yet everything had. Marshall caught my eye. "Clara," she said, her voice thoughtful, "may I ask you something perhaps difficult?" "Of course." "Did you ever consider not forgiving me?" The question deserved honesty. Yes, I said. She absorbed that quietly. What changed your mind? I looked toward the bassinet. Leela. Marshall followed my gaze. This child will learn what family means by watching us, I continued. I want her to see accountability but also reconciliation. Emotion shimmered in Marshall's eyes. You've given me more grace than I earned. Grace isn't earned, I replied softly. That's why it transforms us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then Leela stirred, a small, insistent sound reminding us that the future does not wait for perfect readiness. Marshall rose and lifted her gently. My granddaughter, she whispered again, but this time the words carried no possession, only wonder, and as I watched her sway slowly beside the window, I understood something with quiet certainty. Families are not defined by the absence of fracture. They are defined by what we choose to rebuild afterward. Yet life, as it always does, had one more lesson waiting for us, one that would test not just forgiveness, but the strength of the new foundation we believed we had laid. By the time Leela turned 3 months old, our home had settled into a rhythm that felt almost musical. Not effortless, never effortless, but familiar. Her cries had different meanings now. Ethan could distinguish hunger from fatigue with surprising accuracy, while I had mastered the quiet art of rocking her with one foot while reheating coffee for the 3rd time. Morning light filtered through the nursery curtains, often catching the faint gold threads in the blanket Marshall had made. I noticed how Leela's tiny fingers would curl around its edge as she slept, as if even in dreams she understood the comfort of something crafted with care. Peace had not erased the past, but it had made space around it. And in that space, something resembling trust had begun to live. The invitation arrived on a pale blue card. Marshall's handwriting was unmistakable, deliberate, elegant, slightly old-fashioned. Spring garden gathering in honor of Leela Grace. I turned the card over slowly. She's planning a party. Ethan asked from the couch. It seems so. He smiled faintly. That's her language. Celebration is how she repairs things. I traced the embossed flowers along the border. Months ago, the idea of Marshall hosting an event centered on me, on my child, would have made my shoulders tense. Now I felt only a mild flutter of hesitation. Do you want it? Ethan asked gently. I considered the question carefully. Yes, I said at last. I think it's time our daughter's story exists louder than the old one. The morning of the gathering arrived warm and fragrant, the air carrying that early spring scent of damp earth and new blossoms. Marshall's backyard looked transformed again, though this time not with the precision of performance. There were soft quilts spread across the grass, wildflowers in mismatched jars, nothing overly curated, just welcoming. When she saw us walk through the gate, Leela nestled against my shoulder. Marshall's face opened into a smile that was no longer practiced. It was immediate, almost shy. You came, she said, as though it had ever been uncertain. She leaned close to Leela. Hello, my little rewrite, she whispered. I caught the phrase and met her eyes. Rewrite, not correction, not replacement, a new chapter. Guests drifted toward us, neighbors, cousins, friends from church, even 2 of my former colleagues who brought a stack of children's books tied with ribbon. No one spoke in hushed sympathy now, they spoke in delighted tones. How alert she is! Look at those eyes. She has Ethan's brow. And for the first time since the infertility rumor had first reached my ears, I realized something profound. Narratives can change, but they require patience and visible truth to do so. Halfway through the afternoon, as sunlight warmed the edges of the garden, Marshall tapped a spoon lightly against her glass. The small, familiar gesture quieted the conversations. She looked around the yard slowly before speaking. I want to say something, she began, her voice carried but without theatrical projection. Just clarity. Months ago, I shared assumptions about Clara that were not mine to share. A soft stillness settled. I felt Ethan's hand find the small of my back. I cannot undo those words, she continued, but I can choose what I speak now. She turned toward me. Clara has shown me that dignity does not require volume, only integrity. Then her gaze dropped to Leela. And this child has shown me that hope often arrives quietly while we are busy predicting its absence. No one clapped immediately. The moment felt too sincere for interruption. Instead, there were nods, gentle smiles, understanding. Marshall lifted her glass slightly. To Leela Grace, who entered this family not as proof that we were right, but as a reminder to listen better. This time the applause came warm and unforced. I blinked back unexpected tears. Later, as guests moved toward the dessert table, Denise nudged me lightly. She's different, she murmured. Yes, I agreed. Do you trust it? I watched Marshall kneel carefully beside a quilt, letting Leela grasp her finger. Trust, I had learned, is less a switch than a series of observations. I trust the direction, I said. Denise smiled. That sounds like something motherhood teaches. It teaches many things, I replied quietly. Not every moment that day was effortless. Near the hydrangeas, I overheard a woman whisper, "Isn't this the baby everyone thought would never happen?" The words were not cruel, just careless, but before I could respond, Marshall stepped forward calmly. "No," she said, "this is the baby we were always waiting for, whether we understood it at the time or not." The woman flushed, and just like that, the conversation shifted. I caught Marshall's eye across the yard. She did not look triumphant, only steady. Accountability, I realized again, is not a single apology. It is vigilance. As afternoon softened toward evening, Ethan and I slipped onto the porch for a quiet moment. He rocked the stroller gently with his foot. "You know what I keep thinking?" he said. "What? If someone had told us a year ago that we'd be here, healthy baby, calm family, my mother knitting blankets instead of managing narratives, I wouldn't have believed it." I leaned my head against his shoulder. Growth rarely looks dramatic while it's happening. He nodded. "Are you happy?" The question lingered in the golden air. I searched myself honestly. "Yes," I said, not because everything had been easy, but because we had faced what wasn't and remained. As guests began to leave, Marshall approached carrying a small wooden box. "For Leela," she said. Inside lay a delicate locket. "Open it," she urged. I did. On one side was a tiny engraving, "Your story is yours." My breath caught. "I had it made after she was born," Marshall explained, "a reminder for both of us." Emotion rose quietly in my chest. "Thank you," I whispered. She hesitated, then said something that stilled me completely. "You know, when I told people you were infertile, I thought I was protecting myself from disappointment." She met my gaze steadily, but all I was doing was limiting my imagination for what love could look like. I reached for her hand, and now, she said softly, watching Leela stretch in her stroller, "I understand that love is not something we predict. It is something we learn to recognize when it arrives." The sun dipped lower, washing the garden in amber light. And in that glow, I felt the last tight thread of old resentment loosen, not vanish, but release its hold. Because forgiveness is not amnesia, it is the quiet decision that the past will not be the loudest voice in the room. That night, after we brought Leela home and laid her gently in the crib, I stood there longer than necessary. Ethan wrapped an arm around my waist. "You're thinking again," he said. I was remembering the day at Marshall's table when I first learned what she'd been telling people. And now, I listened to Leela's steady breathing. "Now I see how fragile assumptions are," I said, "and how powerful truth becomes when we live it openly." He kissed my temple. "You turned pain into something steadier." "No," I replied softly, "we did." Outside, a spring breeze stirred the branches. Inside, our daughter slept, unaware of the stories that had preceded her, yet already reshaping them simply by being here. And I understood something with quiet certainty. Families are not the stories we start with. They are the ones we choose to continue telling. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a house after a baby falls asleep. Not emptiness, not loneliness, something fuller than that. A silence made of tiny exhalations, folded blankets, dim hallway lights, and the soft awareness that someone fragile is trusting you to keep the world steady until morning. On the night Leela turned 4 months old, I stood beside her crib longer than usual. Moonlight slipped through the curtains, resting gently across her face. One hand was stretched above her head, a habit she'd had since birth, as though even in sleep she were reaching toward something just beyond her grasp. I brushed my finger across her knuckles. She did not wake. Motherhood had already changed the way I understood time. Days that once felt ordinary now carried weight, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones. Behind me, Ethan leaned softly against the doorframe. "You do that every night," he whispered. "Do what?" "Look at her like you're memorizing something." I smiled faintly. "I think I am." He stepped closer, resting his chin lightly on my shoulder. "Memorizing what?" "How quickly love can rearrange a life." He nodded, and we stood there together, not speaking, not needing to. It struck me then how much had shifted in just 1 year. 12 months earlier, I had been sitting at Marshall's dining table, learning that a story about my body had been traveling through rooms I hadn't entered. A story I never gave permission to tell. And now, here was the truth breathing quietly in front of me. Alive, warm, undeniable, healing rarely announces itself. It reveals itself in moments you almost overlook. Like the Tuesday morning Marshall arrived with fresh bread and did not ring the bell, remembering Leela had finally fallen asleep after a restless night. Or the afternoon she asked me very gently, "What kind of grandmother do you hope I will be?" Not what she planned to be, what I hoped for. Present, I said after thinking a moment, and curious about who she becomes, not who you imagine. Marshall nodded slowly. I can do that. And she did. She stopped offering predictions about Leela's personality. Stopped comparing milestones to Ethan's baby years. Instead, she watched, listened, learned. One afternoon, I found her sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor, letting Leela grasp her finger with determined concentration. She has a strong will, Marshall whispered. She'll need it, I replied. So will we, she said with a small smile. There was no tension in the room, no unspoken corrections hovering in the air, just 3 generations learning each other in real time. Not everything transformed overnight. Occasionally, someone would still say, "We were all so worried you might never have this." And for a brief second, the old irritation would flicker. But I learned something important in those moments. The past loses power when you stop rehearsing it. So instead of correcting every outdated assumption, I simply said, "We were always on our own timeline," and left it there, because peace is not found in winning every clarification. Sometimes it is found in choosing where your energy belongs. Mine belonged here in this house, in this season, in this small sleeping child. When Leela was 5 months old, we gathered again at Marshall's, not for a formal event, just dinner. The same dining room, the same clock ticking softly along the wall, yet the space felt entirely different now, familiar in a deeper way. At one point, while Ethan carved the roast chicken, Marshall looked at me thoughtfully. "Clara," she said, "may I confess something?" "Of course." She folded her hands together. "When you first told us you were pregnant, my initial emotion was not joy. I appreciated the honesty enough to stay very still. It was shame," she continued quietly, "because I realized how confidently wrong I had been." I met her gaze. "Most people never admit that." "I nearly didn't," she said. "But becoming Leela's grandmother has made me reconsider the legacy I want to leave." Legacy, the word settled gently between us. "My mother believed authority made her strong," Marshall went on, "but authority without humility is just distance." She reached across the table and covered my hand. "You invited me back into closeness when you could have chosen distance." I thought about that carefully. "Distance protects," I said, "but closeness transforms if both people are willing." "And I am willing," she replied. I believed her, not because she had never stumbled again, but because she corrected herself when she did. Growth, I was learning, is not perfection, it is responsiveness. Later that evening, as I rocked Leela in the guest room, Denise slipped inside quietly. "Can I ask you something?" she whispered. "Always." "Did it change you, what Mom did?" I considered the question longer than she probably expected. "Yes," I said. "How?" "It made me braver about my boundaries." She leaned against the dresser. "You always seemed calm." "Calm doesn't mean unhurt," I said gently. "It just means I chose not to let hurt be the loudest voice." Denise nodded slowly. "You know, Mom listens differently now, not just to you, to everyone." "That's the thing about accountability," I said. "When it's real, it reshapes more than one relationship." From the crib, Leela stirred and released a small sigh. Denise smiled. "She's going to grow up surrounded by women who learned how to repair things." I hoped that would be true more than anything. Summer arrived in full warmth, and with it came longer evenings. One night, we spread a blanket across the backyard while fireflies stitched brief patterns through the dark. Marshall sat beside me, her shoulder brushing mine. "She'll never know the version of us that existed before her," she said softly. "Every child begins in the middle of a family story," I replied, "but they don't have to inherit its old wounds." She was quiet for a moment, then she asked, "Have you forgiven me completely?" The question was not fragile, just sincere. I thought about it, about that Sunday long ago, the whispered sympathies, the collapsing narrative, the hospital corridors, the apologies, the knitting needles clicking steadily beside my bed. "Yes," I said finally. "Do you know when it happened?" "When?" "The first time I saw you hold her," I answered. I realized that anyone capable of loving my child that gently was not my adversary. Her eyes filled. "I will spend the rest of my life being worthy of that trust." "You don't have to spend a lifetime proving it," I said. "Just keep showing up honestly." She nodded. I can do that. We watched the fireflies together, silent, reflective, two women who had once misunderstood each other profoundly, now joined by the quiet work of loving the same child. And now, as I tell you this story, Leela is asleep upstairs. Ethan is probably double-checking the doors just as he always has. Some habits, thankfully, never change. If you had asked me a year ago what family meant, I might have answered security, predictability, shared history. Now I would say something different. Family is not the absence of mistakes. It is the willingness to face them, to name them, to grow beyond them. My mother-in-law once told the world I was infertile. Today, she tells anyone who will listen that her granddaughter taught her the courage of listening before speaking. Life has a quiet way of humbling us like that. So if you are carrying a hurt tonight, especially one that came from someone meant to protect you, I want you to remember this. People are not frozen in their worst moment. Some are capable of learning. Some are capable of repair. And sometimes, if we allow it, forgiveness does not erase the past, it redeems the future. Before I go, let me ask you something gently. If someone had rewritten your story without permission and later returned with genuine remorse, would you have found the strength to forgive? I would truly like to know. And if this story touched something in your heart, consider sharing it with someone who might need the reminder that healing is possible even inside imperfect families. Take care of your heart, and thank you for listening.